Okay, we can begin now.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us today. I'm going to give maybe a couple of minutes just to watch the attendee list fill up a little bit more, but no more than just a few since we only have an hour. But sit tight and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes.
Test.
If you're just joining us, we're just giving a bit of time for our attendee list to populate, and about another 30 seconds, and I think we should get going. All right, let's kick this off this afternoon. So good afternoon and welcome to our third and final webinar leading up to the two-day consultations on Canada's next National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security that is occurring this Thursday and Friday in Ottawa. My name is Sarah Tuckey. I'm a PhD candidate in public administration at the University of Ottawa. I'm also a part-time management consultant, and I'm a longtime member of the WPSNC. So I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar today. Today our discussion is on feminist foreign policy and international assistance, and what we've learned from previous efforts that can inform the next iteration of the Canadian National Action Plan, or CNAP. So throughout this webinar, we're encouraging you to post your questions in the text box on your screen, and we will reserve some time at the end of the webinar to address as many of these as we can. You're also encouraged to visit the website for the consultations. That's www.cnapconsult.org, cnapconsult.org, to find further details about the consultation, to participate in the survey and online discussion, and to read some of the documents previously and specifically prepared for the consultations coming up this week. So the first CNAP, launched in 2010, focused on the traditional women, peace and security pillars of prevention, participation, protection, and relief and recovery. At this time last year, the WPSNC hosted a workshop to begin the discussion around the renewal of the CNAP, which expired at the end of 2015. And since then, much has changed in the global context, and new important challenges have emerged globally that need to be dealt with to raise security for both women and men. Canada's feminist foreign policy has a long history and has taken many forms. So our commitment to action on the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security have remained a factor in much of Canada's work on women's rights and gender equality. We also know that the former CEDA has had a policy on gender equality for more than 30 years, with new iterations that took it from the concept of women in development, or WID, to gender and development, or GAD, transforming it over the years. This transformation is in large part due to a global gender mainstreaming effort, which calls for gender equality concerns to be entrenched in programming approaches across all policy areas, and which has informed the Status of Women Canada's Gender-Based Analysis Plus, or GBA Plus, analytical tool. We've also seen specifically that Canada has committed to maternal, newborn, and child health initiatives through the previous Conservative government. But with all of these in mind, how much have we learned from these initiatives? How successful were they really? What more could we do, or what more could have been done? And with these broad questions in mind, I'd like to introduce our expert speakers today. So I'm just going to advance the slides a bit here. We have Rebecca Thiessen, who is an Associate Professor of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her research interests include gender and development, global citizenship and volunteer abroad, Canadian foreign aid policy, and Canada and Canadians in the world. And we also have Rebecca Wolsak, who supports the work of Interpares in Asia, in particular in relation to Burma. She spent 5 years living and working on Burma's borders and has returned to Canada to work specifically with Interpares. Our experts come from academic and practical backgrounds, so they will provide an excellent balanced take on Canada's feminist foreign policy potential and what it means for the next CNAP. So with that said, I would now like to turn the webinar over to Rebecca Thiessen to begin our discussion today. So thank you very much, Rebecca, and as you know, please feel free to let me know when you'd like me to advance the presentation slides in whatever way you'd like. So here we are.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And I apologize for background noise. I'm away at a conference and try to find a quiet space at Trinity College to make my presentation. So the reason I'm actually here in Toronto is to present a paper I'm working on whether or not Prime Minister Trudeau has indeed embarked on a feminist foreign policy and looking at it through the lens of women, peace, and security. Commitments to international feminist goals gained popularity in mainstream discourse in 2016 when Sweden declared its commitment to pursue a feminist foreign policy. Several important signals emerging from the Liberal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also raised the profile of potential feminist commitments as central to Canadian foreign policy. The notion of integrating a feminist approach to foreign policy and international relations is hardly new, however, with an illustrious feminist scholarship documenting the value and significance of understanding feminist foreign policy goals and redressing gender inequalities in world interactions. Plus, a long history of women's rights movements promoting government policies that address women's concerns, particularly in peace and security matters. Yet the buzz generated around feminist foreign policy since the election of Prime Minister Trudeau in 2015 facilitated a renewed set of conversations and debates in the Canadian context, largely championed by the civil society community in their efforts to examine Canada and its actions in light of criteria for a feminist vision for women, peace, and security initiatives. So if you could go to the next slide. Here's the overview of the remarks I'm going to make, dealing specifically with some of those examples of feminist foreign policy that's been in the spotlight, some of the civil society criticisms, and some of the scholarly insights. I'll talk a little bit about what's new, maybe what's a bit different, and then end with some recommendations. So going to the next slide. In 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau made headlines for his remarks on feminism. But some of those comments came earlier, when in 2015 he appointed half the positions in the federal cabinet, and naming women to some of those key ministerial positions, half the cabinet to women. This was the first strategic move which was justified by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in his response to why half the cabinet comprises women, when he effortlessly stated, because it's 2015. His remarks signaled that it is about time gender equality is considered a core value of the Canadian government and its work. Subsequent remarks reaffirmed the Prime Minister when he declared that he's proud to be a feminist, a statement made at the United Nations conference organized by UN Women in March 2016. He went on to note, it shouldn't be something that creates reaction. It's simply saying that I believe in the equality of men and women, and we still have an awful lot of work to do to get there. These remarks call for a normalization of gender equality and a feminist approach as an important first step to 1, clarifying what it means to be a feminist, 2, understanding why it matters from a human rights and equality perspective, and 3, examining how something so fundamental and basic remains sidelined, ignored, and sometimes even ridiculed. These commitments were further bolstered by the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development report called An Opportunity for Global Leadership, Canada and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which recommended Canada make women, peace and security a foreign policy priority. These commitments were further bolstered through this process. Moving to the next slide. However, the rhetoric and discourse of a feminist foreign policy and commitments to gender equality were quickly matched by calls for action, as NDP critic Hélène Laverdière argued in March 2017. Feminist foreign policy needs more than rhetoric. And she goes on to note that, quote, a truly feminist government would also fund the women, peace and security agenda, emphasis on fund. Over the last decade, the issue of women, peace and security was largely neglected by the Canadian government, despite Canada's leading role in achieving things like the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Reports on Canada's National Action Plan were frequently late, and the agenda was underfunded. The scarcity of funds has been one of the key challenges of implementing the WPS agenda at both the national and the global level. Some civil society organizations were quick to praise Prime Minister Trudeau's open discussion of a feminist approach. The significance of this rhetoric, the potential impacts of such remarks for practice, in the months to follow, to critically evaluate his feminist commitments beyond rhetoric, with Oxfam Canada, for example, preparing a feminist scorecard. In a blog for the McLeod Group, Beth Warniak reports on the early indications as mixed. For example, civil society operations were organized with business as usual in the form of selling military vehicles to Saudi Arabia, given the country's poor track record on women's and human rights, raising questions about the extent to which gender equality and women's rights are truly integrated into a Canadian feminist foreign policy approach. Other important gestures presented by Prime Minister Trudeau pointed to re-engaging meaningfully in the United Nations commitments to peace operations, renewing the CNAP, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, and 2017 commitments to redirect existing development funding to sexual and reproductive health for women around the world. Yet these gestures, while positive first steps, or as Beth calls them, jumping off points, are insufficient for shifting how we understand security and bringing women peace builders and gender perspectives to the center of conflict prevention and response, as Beth says. Similarly, in a more recent assessment, Sarah Rieger argues that the feminist approach by the Canadian government under the Trudeau Liberals is, quote, more talk than action. And Oxfam's feminist scorecard documented the actions taken by the Liberal government, the results of which were raised in March 2017, leading up to International Women's Day. And they called for the government to turn feminist words into action. The scorecard measures Canada's progress on affecting the lives of women in Canada and around the world, with the attention to several categories. Noting Prime Minister Trudeau's commitment to gender parity in Cabinet, the report demonstrates progress, at least in the area of representation. Other important commitments made include Canadian-focused priorities, such as the launching of the National Inquiry on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls. I think an important departure from previous
feminist organization. The name means among equals, which is a nice quick summary of how we like to work. I work on our Burma program, and over the past year I have been quite involved with the Women's Rights Policy Group in our work, looking at Global Affairs' International Assistance Review and their efforts to, or at least talk about using a feminist approach. And so some of my presentation relies on some of those conversations that I've been part of over the past year. So as Rebecca already mentioned, oh, there we go. We do have a Prime Minister who is very comfortable using the term feminist. I just want to note, though, that to state the obvious, most Canadians are not, including other MPs. The civil service is not comfortable with it, and even many of us within civil society. And it's very unclear what Prime Minister Trudeau means when he says he's a feminist. And this is something we really, really need to dig into. And as Rebecca said, as part of the International Assistance Review that happened, it was launched last May. It was launched with a discussion paper, and right at the beginning, Minister Bibo had a message, and she talked about using a feminist lens that would be applied throughout all of Canada's international assistance activities. And then later, a few pages later in the discussion paper, in the section on health and rights of women and children, the very first discussion question also notes this feminist commitment, talking about building on our commitment to a feminist approach and support for the gender equality goal of the 2030 Agenda. Where should Canada focus its international assistance efforts in this area? So I just wanted to sort of remind us of that background before, and the fact that the discussion paper mentions this feminist approach, but it really doesn't define it, doesn't go into any detail as to what it means. And I think that that's really important. For example, just last week, I was at a workshop it was 4 global affairs staff working on issues related to Sri Lanka and Burma, looking at what they termed a sort of post-conflict context. I am using quote marks with my fingers there. And I was having a conversation, we were in this small group, and I was talking about using a feminist approach. And a woman from Global Affairs who had just retired a couple of days beforehand, so interrupted me and said she preferred that I didn't use that word. She said that she found it limiting because it meant we would only focus on women's rights, and that for her it was really important to talk about gender equity. And I find little encounters like that super useful to remind us about the fact that we may not all know what we're talking about here, and that we all might be talking about different things. I often use the term feminist. It's a nice quick shorthand for me, but just a reminder that we need to be very specific. So when I'm talking about a feminist approach, what we're talking about from Into Paris's perspective, is an approach that seeks to address the root causes of structural and systemic inequalities, and to transform systems of power. And many of those systems are grounded in social constructions of gender and patriarchal attempts to control women's bodies and women's choices. So that's a sort of a quick nutshell of what we mean by feminist, but to break it down into some principles, because it can be interpreted and used in many different ways. I think there's 3 key principles that we should be looking at. The first one is intersectionality. Now, this is a framework that recognizes the multiple aspects of identity that play out in our lives and experiences, such as class or skin color, and these compound or exacerbate the oppressions and marginalizations. Intersectionality also challenges us to expand our understanding of gender beyond binaries, man, woman, femininity, masculinity. And it compels us to identify and address really complex contexts. So that's one principle. The second principle, these are in no particular order, is agency. And agency is an individual or a group's ability to make choices and to transform those choices into desired outcomes. Feminist agency includes principles of autonomy, of choice, empowerment, and meaningful engagement. Agency allows us to recognize that individuals are experts and knowledge holders in their own right. And then the third principle, I would say, is process. And this is one that can be particularly difficult for government, for example, or really any large entity, because a feminist lens is not just about results. It's about how you reach those results. What is the process you engage in? So fundamental to a feminist process is integrity, contextualization, learning, collaboration, participation, inclusivity, and responsiveness, to name a few. So those are the 3 key principles, if you sort of boil it down for me. And just to note that in practice, when you're using a feminist lens, it needs to go hand in hand with a human rights-based approach, because both frameworks should put the rights holders and their needs at the center of development. So to take on a feminist approach really means shifting from a supply-driven approach, which prioritizes service delivery, shifting that approach, which is sort of the old school development, into one that is feminist, that is driven by an approach that positions individuals' needs and their realities at the center of all initiatives. So ultimately, this approach must challenge systemic inequality, unjust power systems, discriminatory laws, policies, programs, all of it at the local, at the national, regional, at global levels. So it's complicated. So integrity and coherence are really fundamental to this feminist work. So it's difficult to look at a feminist approach to international development in isolation from a whole of government approach, which is, I think, something Rebecca touched on as well. So I think many of us would have had experiences. I think the most common or easy one that comes to mind is the fact that you could be doing amazing things in development and then have a trade policy that can literally undermine the results of that development work. So it's great to have a feminist approach to international assistance, but far, far better to have a feminist foreign policy where you would have hopefully a whole of government approach. This image, by the way, these are the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are often talked about as interconnected, and that focus on interconnection is also, I would say, a feminist analysis, and it is what makes everything rather messy. It makes it complicated, but acknowledging these connections is one of the first steps to a feminist approach. So I thought I would just quickly, for sort of illustrative purposes, do a little quick comparison of program development as it's done now, as it has been done for the past few years, and compare that to potentially a feminist way of developing a program. This is getting a little bit away from the National Action Plan, but I thought that to get concrete about programming might be hopefully useful for some people. So this is, I'm going to be generalizing, but I think familiar territory for people. So when Global Affairs decides to launch a project, first, I mean, often they have identified particular countries of focus. I've used Burma as the example because it's one familiar to me. So that they've identified various countries of focus, and then they put out a call for proposals, and let's say it's for women, peace, and security issues in Burma. So in that call for proposals, Global Affairs will have defined the parameters, the framework to that program. They'll have defined the high-level outcomes. They'll often define the timeline, sometimes very, very in a detailed manner, the budget, the targets at a high level, all designed by Global Affairs. There are, once they put out that call for proposals, there is an opportunity sometimes, often for, I wouldn't call it discussion, I would, it's a format of submitting questions through a certain portal by a designated timeline, and you will probably get your questions publicly answered. There is a deadline given for submitting a proposal. It's often really quite fast, 2 to 3 months, and then there'll be silence usually. Could be for 6 months, could be for a year and a half before we find out whether our proposal is accepted. So that's, I mean, I would say a fairly real description of how program development's working, right, through some aspects, some branches of global affairs. And so if we were to flip that and make it feminist, how could we do that? So first and foremost, the problems to be identified by the local people, not by global affairs necessarily. Local people, local civil society, maybe a Canadian NGO will be involved in discussing these the root causes of the problems and potential solutions. The NGO, maybe a Canadian NGO would meet with global affairs, play a bit of an intermediary role perhaps, looking at what does global affairs need, what do the local communities need, how do we work with the local civil society, how to build that, recognizing there are a multiplicity of different needs and agendas at play. And fundamentally, I guess, for us, in order for this to be a feminist approach, really early on discussing how this program will address power, how it will address structural barriers to gender equality. Then the local communities and civil society will develop concept notes, will have a discussion back and forth with global affairs. There are experts within global affairs. There are experts everywhere. But just to say that there can be some amazing discussions had with global affairs. Unfortunately, I would say that the shifts that have been made more recently to bring, to encourage, well, require staff to move on every 2 years, that, in my opinion, it is undermining the capacity for some staff to build their expertise, but an exchange, a back and forth, can prove to be really, can be very useful to program development. So then in a feminist program, the proposal will be drafted, discussed, submitted, and really critically the process, the approval process would be transparent, including a timeline that people could see and know about in advance. So that's a very quick comparison of the two. I thought it might be useful just to also look at my experience in Burma. If we look at there's a long ongoing divisive, problematic peace process happening in Burma. And when I look at, if you talk about the peace process and you talk about women in Burma, generally what people talk about is we are working to get women at the table. That is important, absolutely. But it is often the be-all and the end-all for people. And for me, it's a classic example of the sort of the projectization that we are experiencing. And to some extent, projectization is the antithesis of feminist work, and something we really need to struggle against. It's a top-down way of working that really limits the focus of your work and makes it impossible to adapt to a complex problem such as conflict. So in my experience in Burma, you see a lot of individual projects, like a project that comes in and trains army leaders on human rights with a special module on gender, or an NGO that'll come in and give young women peace-building training, or an NGO that will come in and build shelters for women who experience violence. All of these these are important initiatives, but if in order for them to have long-term impact, in order for them to actually be looking at structural transformative change, there's a real need to broaden and complicate programming. So a feminist approach might look at a peace process and say, can civil society transform the embedded power structures within a process that is framed and controlled by elite, predominantly military men? And how? What are the multiplicity of approaches we could use? You need women at the table who have relevant experience and who are supported by a community and have a mandate from their community. And you need women who are in civil society observing, critiquing, feeding into the discussion within and outside those official talks. So in the example I know best of the program that I work on in terms of Burma and feminist work, we are working on those three pillars, those three principles of intersectionality, agency, and process. We're working with women within their own ethnicities, within their own religious groups, as well as multiple ethnics. And we're working with civil society as well as women's organizations, so that we're ensuring that there is that transformational power analysis happening amongst everyone. Absolutely critical that it's happening with there is support for women's rights, women's organizations, but it's also critical for other members of civil society to share these analyses. So in terms of agency, we're recognizing local expertise. We're often supporting exchanges. Also often supporting things that are not the sexy projects. There's support for organizational development, for translation, for transportation, for childcare. This all helps in terms of agency, in terms of process and intersectionality. And I think just to end on process, it's really critical when you're doing feminist work to have a comprehensive and complicated, complex understanding of the work and of the context in which you're working, and to have long-term trusted relationships with local grassroots civil society. And if you have those, then you're very well placed to manage a responsive program, and that's really critical to feminist process and to working in a conflict situation. You need to be able to adjust, to be flexible to the emerging context. So I think I'll leave it there, just to really highlight that it's a complicated and interconnected approach that's constantly looking at power structures and adapting to this analysis. And with that kind of a feminist approach, the results can be really long-term and transformational.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca Wolczak, Rebecca W., for your fantastic presentation. I think we really appreciate your layout of what feminism means from a project perspective, from a process perspective, including intersectionality and the agency of women. That's extremely important. And in addition, your perspectives from your experience are really valuable for helping us understand what that looks like. So we'll now switch back to my screen and back to the original PowerPoint. So thanks again to Monique for that. I'll just set the slideshow back up here. So we're in the last about 10 minutes of the webinar today. So let's move to addressing some of the questions from listeners and questions that we've got in mind from these two presentations. So given the discussions we've just had, I'd like to flip it over to Rebecca Thiessen and to look at looking at this from sort of an academic perspective, based on what we've heard today. What would you consider are the priorities for the Canadian government now? From your recommendations from Rebecca's presentation as well, what do you consider your priorities going forward for the next CNAP?
Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of priorities. The key is really to be managing a number of things at the same time. I think that's what's really important. I was asked to meet with the Minister of Foreign Affairs on the phone to discuss how to address security, gender, and peace in the future. And I had talked about feminism, and he had said something along the lines of, well, you know, that's Sweden's thing, and, you know, we want to do something different. We want to set ourselves apart a little bit, so we're not going to be talking about a feminist foreign policy. And so it's interesting that, you know, when we think about how people approach language, that there's perhaps a tendency to try to be sort of different than other people, not maybe recognizing how valuable it is to move forward in a feminist model collaboratively and en masse. So I thought that was interesting. So in terms of priorities, one of the things that I have recommended to people in government include making sure that gender equality is being addressed while we're doing other things. So it's great to invest in women's organizations, and we need to do that, but we need to invest in women's organizations in ways that allow them to try to address the root causes of gender inequality. We continue to talk, like Minister Dubois, around the idea of feminism and gender equality, but there's too often a slippage into addressing the needs of women and girls. And so we really have to make it a priority to talk about what we value and what's core to a feminist vision. And that is indeed much more than just targeting women and girls for things like health or education. So my point about priorities is that we have to really think about doing things simultaneously. And I think, you know, funding women's organizations is key, making sure that there are resources that back up the kinds of commitments that we're keen to address. Is just one step, is really important.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I find it interesting that you mentioned how the government wants to brand it, how the brand of feminist foreign policy is Sweden's thing. And that's an interesting commodification, really, of the approach itself. So with that in mind, I'd love to ask Rebecca W., just from your personal experience, how has Global Affairs Canada or the government itself been receptive to the concepts of a feminist foreign policy that you laid out in your presentation? I know this could be very speculative, but maybe you have some experience with Interpares that can tell us a bit more about their receptiveness to the kinds of work you do, and what you think could be the future for that.
Sure. I mean, I would. One quick clarification, I would say that any conversations I've had where we've talked about a feminist foreign policy, folks from the Government of Canada have been interested, but clear that a feminist foreign policy is not particularly on the table right now. And a feminist approach to international assistance is what they are open to discussing, and have not just open to discussing, they've put on the table. My sense is that, like something I said in my presentation, is just that I think there is leadership there. It's clear that the minister, the Prime Minister's office are keen to talk about having a feminist approach. How far down the chain of command that goes is somewhat limited, and then how nuanced and comprehensive the understanding of what that might actually mean, and how it impacts the work, everyday work, is really wide open. Definitely, I'm aware of some resistance within Global Affairs, but also some excitement and some interest. So it's sort of a full spectrum.
Great, thank you. We actually have another question for you, Rebecca W., from our listeners. They would like to know how you place local government and or national government in the feminist program development for WPS in Burma, as CEDA/Global Affairs Canada consider as Burma government's counterpart. And that's from Naima Chowdhury at Coady International Institute.
Okay, that feels like a giant question, and we have a couple of minutes. I would love to. I'd love to continue the conversation offline. I mean, just to touch briefly on it, to say that like almost everything in Burma, it's very, very complicated, and there are large sections of the country where, when you talk about local government, you are talking about a government that is not necessarily officially recognized by the government of Canada, but locally recognized as the governing body. So, for example, in Karen State, that would be managed by, much of Karen State is managed by the Karen National Union. So those local governments do complicate things. I think that when we're talking about how to engage, how it impacts our engagement with global affairs, it's always it's one of the complications is the various agendas at play. So if I look at a particular issue of concern right now, I would imagine many people are familiar with the atrocities that are happening in Arakan State and the particular situation of Rohingya people. Many people are raising the alarm that we are looking at signs of a genocide. And the Canadian government has been pushing for action at the UN level, but what the actions taken by the embassy are somewhat limited, and I think they're limited by the various agendas that they're trying to meet and trying to maintain relationships with various levels of the government within Burma. So it's a point of extreme frustration, because you have conversations that are very public, conversations that are private, and then various unofficial conversations taking place, and how to have accountability and how to ensure, as a Canadian NGO, that we see our Canadian government really pushing for the safety and security and the prevention of extreme violence.
Thank you very much for answering that question as easily or as quickly as you could in the tiny amount of time left. It's certainly a massive, massive conversation, and there are many others just like that we're hoping to address in detail with the consultations coming up in a couple of days. So with that, I'd like to move just to some quick concluding remarks. First of all, obviously a massive thank you to both the Rebeccas that are here with us today for giving us such excellent perspectives on feminist foreign policy and what it means for Canada and the CNAP debates. A couple of orders of business. If you didn't feel like your voice was heard today, or if you have something you've been mulling over and you want to talk about a little bit more further with us, you can fill out our survey. If you can see on the screen, the survey is on cnapconsult.org/survey. You can also listen to the previous webinars that we've had. Ours will go up as a recording at the end. But we've also got Canadian policies on refugees, and we've got more than counting women in the military. Those were both last week. And finally, you can check out additional resources leading up to the consultations at our resources page. That includes publications by the WPSNC and other groups, and also some insights from people that are our members or from civil society. So there's a lot of conversation going on there as well. And also to thank Monique Cullerier, I can never really get your last name there, for supporting our webinar today and switching between the screens and making sure we can all be heard. So thank you so much for that. And with that, concludes our discussion today. So thanks all, and have a great afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you in Ottawa on Thursday and Friday for the consultations.
Thank you, Sarah.